Cool. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our event on D&I data gathering. Once again, huge apologies for the mix-up with the registration system, and thank you for hanging on in there for this long. We'll do what we can to make up time. We'll have to play things a little bit by ear, I think, from now on. So I'm Andrea Brewster. I'm the Lead Executive Officer of IP Inclusive, and I'm the person responsible for all this. So I'm the person you send the nasty emails to afterwards. In this event, we are hoping to inform and encourage and explore, I think, a topic that's becoming increasingly important for our sector. So hopefully you'll have received the agenda through Eventbrite. Maybe not, but anyway, the plan is we'll have a panel discussion to start with. That'll be the first half of the event, and that'll be recorded. And then there'll be a 5-minute break while I faff around setting up breakout rooms. What could possibly go wrong there? Then we'll have some smaller discussions in breakout groups, which will be facilitated, and a plenary session to bring together all the ideas that were generated in those breakout sessions. We were aiming to finish at 6 o'clock. I'll do my damnedest. We may have to run over a little bit, so if you have to leave, I will quite understand. So I'd like to introduce you, first of all, to the 4 panelists, and to ask you, in line with usual Zoom protocols, to keep your microphone on mute during this first part of the session, just so there's no distracting background noises. So our 4 panelists who've kindly agreed to share their ideas and expertise with us today are in alphabetical order. We've got Pauline Beck, who's the Head of Social Research and Statistics at the UK IPO. We've got Jonathan Clark, Director of HR at Kilburn & Strode, a patent and trademark firm. Hi, Jonathan. We've got Matthew Clayton, who's a partner and solicitor at Willans, and Stella Chandler, a director at Focal Point Training, who've worked very closely with IP Inclusive on a lot of D&I related projects. Together, we're going to explore the journey, if you like, for a typical organisation from the point where you start deciding whether or not to gather diversity data through to making good use of the data afterwards. And I'm going to start with Pauline, though, very briefly, Pauline, because I gather the government has a nice slogan that it uses in this context, which I think would give a nice sort of backdrop for our discussions today.
Yes, so the slogan is actually better statistics, better decision, or better data, better decisions. And I think if you look at the last 6 months, it shows how important gathering data has been, especially diversity data. So you wouldn't be able to get the same value out of COVID figures without talking of gender, age, ethnicity, and pre-existing conditions. And without those like disaggregation, you wouldn't have the same story to tell, and you wouldn't be able to make this more clever and better decisions. So this is why we've got a slogan. I think it's changed recently to statistics for public good, but the idea is here.
The government does quite like changing its slogans. I've noticed that. In times of peril, change your slogan. Right, okay, so better data, better decisions. That's the backdrop for all of this. I'm sure we're all in agreement. Jonathan, can I start with you then? We're going to start on the journey from deciding whether or not to gather data. Tell us why Kilburn & Strode decided to start gathering D&I data. What were the key motivators for you?
Yeah, no, thanks, Andrea. And hello, everybody. The key motivators, Andrea, were really some personal from my perspective, but also organizational wide. So, of course, being members of IP Inclusive, signing up to that charter, if a partner 3 years ago asked me, what's our gender split? How many people have we got in the organization from a minority ethnic background? I wasn't able to say because we didn't record that data. And so fundamentally, I think for me, being part of IP Inclusive, being strong supporters of our diversity and inclusion agenda, just really, really simple. You have to have the information at your fingertips so that you can start to measure your progress. So from a personal perspective, as an HR director, people asking me, and I didn't know. So I had to find a way to gather that information. And from an organizational perspective, being able to measure our progress, because diversity and inclusion is important to us. And of course, you can't measure progress unless you have a benchmark of where you're starting from.
Mm. And tell me, Jonathan, are your clients starting to ask more for D&I data?
Yes, we have seen that in the last 12 to 18 months. So when we pitch for work, it's usually from US corporations that I've noticed. As part of the pitch document, they ask a number of diversity questions. They're not necessarily asking for a lot of detail, but they're trying to scratch under the surface of, are you serious about diversity in your organization? And of course, having data helps with that. So our clients do want to see their attorney team more diverse.
Yeah, and as you say, you need the data to be able to establish that. So yeah,
That's
good
right.
starting point. Stella, Focal Point you are trainers and consultants in HR and related issues, and also a lot in diversity and inclusion. What do you tell your clients about the benefits of D&I data gathering?
Thank you, Andrea. Well, Pauline and Jonathan have really set the scene perfectly for what I would want to say, because it's exactly that. It's helping people really identify where they are at that point. People will often come to us and they're talking about wanting to, think about their diversity and particularly their inclusion as well. And I think we need to talk about that. But we're looking at the moment to gather data to think about, how diverse we are. Of course, it's something else when we think about how inclusive we are. But we start talking to people very much about that. And it's in order to do that, they have to know the starting point. And of course, then it's also, again, as Jonathan was just saying, it's then going to help them map their progress. But they often will come to us as well, and they've got a sense of what it may be. And they, particularly if they're talking to us about a solution they've thought about, when we ask them a bit more about that, that's when, again, it normally comes out and becomes clearer that they do really need that start point of actually having the specific data in order to know whether they are picking the right solution. And I know we'll talk about that more as we go on, but it's that crucial start point that is really, really important. We talk very much about that being a benefit, and again, helps in all the other things that we'll touch on later on.
And from the people point of view, do you think it helps build the confidence of your employees, that they know you care about it and that you are going to measure the outcomes?
Definitely. And again, I think as Jonathan was saying as well, it really gives a sense of people that an organisation are being serious at it. And I hate to use this expression, but we all know people talk about tick box exercises. And if they see that the organisation is taking a proper approach and really wants to make a difference because they want to know the progress and they want to know that, in intangible figures, yes, absolutely, it's very much part of that approach, and a proper approach that will build the trust. And that's, again, a key area in this thing, that will build the trust that actions are then going to be taken because we really do want to understand where we're at and where we want to be. Okay.
So between you and Jonathan have sort of covered off there's business development benefits potentially from working with clients. There's engagement benefits with your own staff. There's all sorts of benefits around your organisation's future strategy and things. Matthew, I want to bring you in at this point. Now, you're a data protection and employment solicitor. And what I'd like to ask you is the obvious question that's in everyone's minds. What are the benefits of D&I data gathering from the legal point of view? What are the incentives from perhaps the employment law point of view?
Thanks, Andrea, and hello, everybody. There's no actual legal obligation that says, or generally speaking, there's no legal obligation that says you must collect D&I data, at least in the private sector. But there are laws, as you'll probably be aware, about not discriminating against people on grounds of their protected characteristics. And in that context, there's a couple of very good legal reasons why you might want to embark upon this exercise. So in terms of protecting your business against potential legal claims. So firstly, if an employee or a candidate brings a discrimination claim against your practice, the legal hurdle that they have to get over to demonstrate that they've got a prima facie claim is quite a low one. And once they're able to get over that hurdle, the burden of proof then actually shifts to you to prove that whatever decision it is that they're complaining about was taken on legitimate grounds and non-discriminatory grounds. And although there might be, very good evidence of what the actual reason for the decision was, an employment tribunal is always going to have in the back of its mind, well, was there any unconscious bias, any hidden bias going on here? And if you can demonstrate that you've got a general culture within the organisation that discourages discrimination and promotes equal opportunity, and that you've got a proper D&I strategy underpinned by a data gathering exercise, that's going to help to sort of counter any suggestion that the motivation for the decision was a discriminatory one. The other reason is that decisions in organisations are taken by individuals. Now, they may be taking that decision on behalf of the organisation, but it's the individual that takes the decision, and therefore it's the individual that might be discriminating. But the organisation has legal liability for that. And the organisation's defence is to show that it took reasonable steps to prevent discrimination from occurring. So again, being able to show that you've got an inclusion strategy that's underpinned by a comprehensive data gathering exercise is going to help you in showing that you've taken reasonable steps to prevent that kind of thing happening within the organisation, so that you can defend yourselves legally if it does happen in that unfortunate event.
That makes a lot of sense, and of course it's a much stronger case for some people than those who are going to argue this is just a namby-pamby waste of time would be well to think about things like that. Stella, what amongst your clients do you think are the biggest disincentives for D&I data gathering? What are the things that most put them off? Is it the legal side of things?
Yeah, I think there's two things probably, and the things that we talk to people about is how to do it. Probably I'm going to end up saying three in a while if I break that down. So how to do it in the first instance, the practical side of it,
which we'll come to in a minute. Yeah.
How to assure people that it will be done, confidentiality will be protected, and sort of how the information is going to be used. And I think also, which we encourage, of course, people to think about as well, so we don't want to put people off doing this, but also along the lines of saying to people, you're now raising an expectation that something will be done. So let's think about what your next steps would be. And I think if I was honest, and Andre, I've talked to you about this before Focal Point, I was latterly an HR manager. And that was one of our sort of motivations for starting to think about some of the solutions to help people, because I would sit there as an HR manager knowing I wanted to do something, very practically probably not having the time, but again, not just knowing how I could really go about doing that. So again, that's why we sort of tried to put some things in place to help people do that. But I think for me, it's that the biggest thing is, as I say, it's people worrying about the confidentiality and then thinking, how would I set myself up? What would I need to do next?
Okay. So we'll hopefully touch on both of those now. I'm going to bring you back in again, Matthew, because this issue of confidentiality and data protection is right at the front of people's minds when they're thinking about whether to do a survey and how. So can you talk us through some of the legal issues around that, the potential pitfalls and how to avoid them?
Yeah, the anonymity, the confidentiality point is a very important one. I'll come to that in a moment. But I think the first thing you've got to think about is, what protected characteristics are you going to look at in your survey? You might want to start with the list of legally protected characteristics. So, the usual ones: age, disability, gender, gender identity, orientation, race and ethnic, national origin, religion and belief, those sort of things. There are also some other characteristics that are protected by law, but it's sort of less common to see questions asked about those. There are subsections of the ethnicity question to do with color or nationality, which are actually separate issues but might be covered by the same question. People who are in a marriage or in a civil partnership have specific protection under the law. It's sort of less common to see questions about that in surveys, but you could explore that. And obviously pregnancy or maternity is a protected status as well, but that's something that changes over time. So if you ask the question one year, it may not be valid the next year. The situation may have changed. You might also want to think about other indicators that you might want to monitor, but they're not necessarily legally protected. So things like social background, education, carer status and things like that, because you might want to do some modelling around that in your organisations. And you might also want to sort of explore the experience of people who have those protected characteristics. So it's not just a question of saying, well, we have X number of Black people in our organisation, or we have X% of Muslim religion, etc. You might want to know, have those people ever had to have recourse to grievance processes, or experienced harassment or bullying and that kind of thing, or what's their length of service, how long are they likely to stay within the organisation. Sorry, there's quite a lot to cover here, actually. So sorry if I'm waffling on.
No, Andrea. I suppose what we're trying to get at is because these are protected characteristics, and therefore it's very sensitive personal data. What do you have to be really careful about? Do you have to make these questions which are optional? For can you force people to answer these?
Yeah. Well, the first thing to think about is that. If you are collecting data that is about an identifiable or identified person, that will be personal data. It will be covered by GDPR. So even if you're apparently collecting it on an anonymous basis, if the person could be identified from that, then it will be personal data. So for instance, if their IP address is unknowingly collected, or if it could be worked out what their identity is from the aggregation of data that you've got. For instance, they're a director and they're Black. You only have one Black director in the organisation, therefore it's obvious who it is, and therefore if they disclose their sexuality as well, you've suddenly got personal data, even if it's collected on an anonymous basis. So you're going to have explicit consent from them to collect that data, probably in most cases. And what explicit consent means is that there has to be a positive action, and it has to be on the basis of informed consent as well. So the provision of information about how the data is collected, how it's going to be stored, what it's going to be used for, is very important in being able to demonstrate that it's informed consent. The question of whether it's explicit consent or not is probably indicated by the fact that they've chosen to complete the questionnaire. But of course, it's only a positive action to do that if they've got the option not to do it. And you might say, yes, you can either complete this questionnaire or you don't have to. That might just lead to people not completing it at all. Therefore, you might want a sort of more nuanced approach and making them aware that it's open to them to answer certain questions and not others. And that all goes to questionnaire design, which I guess Pauline is going to talk about a bit. Under GDPR, there's also principles to do with data accuracy and data minimization. So make sure you're only collecting the data that you actually need to collect, that you're actually going to use, and it's not excessive. And make sure the questions allow people to sort of identify themselves accurately. So again, this is about questionnaire design, but you know, there's lots of different ethnic origins. So if you're only giving people a limited number of options, they may not be able to identify themselves accurately. So you need to think about how you're going to encompass that within the questionnaire design. Does that give you some?
That's a really good starting point, actually, and it leads nicely into some of the other things that we'll come on to discuss, in particular around, you know, Stella's point about trust in terms of communicating with people about the survey. But Pauline, perhaps we can turn to you, as Matthew suggested, and can you give us some tips on survey design, some best practices, to ensure that you're sort of maximizing uptake for something which essentially has to be voluntary, and B, to make sure that you're gathering statistically meaningful and usable data?
Yes, thank you, Andrea. I think the main rule is make sure you collect what you're meant to. So do you know what it is you're trying to collect? Have you looked at past literature? Some questions, especially when it comes to demographic questions, they are usually some harmonized principle whereby across household survey that the government does, for example, or some research organization use exactly the same wording, and that allows you to contrast and compare. So keep it simple and make sure there's no jargon, make sure there's no acronym. Sometimes even the simplest word are misunderstood. So if you have the opportunity to maybe test your questions to see if people understand before you send it out on the field, that's usually a good step to take. Some of the common mistakes in terms of question design that we see is, for example, double barreling your questions, so asking two questions in one, like, do you like Zoom and Eventbrite? Yes, no. Or you could either like one of the other or both. So it doesn't give you the right data or the data that you're expecting. So in terms of like how the survey is laid out as well, and some things that you need to consider, especially around question ordering. So an example would be if you were asked, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? Give an answer. And then the following question might be, how often do you date? If the questions were asked the other way around, how often do you date and how satisfied are you with your life? That might have an impact on how the respondents answer. So that's something to keep in mind when designing, like how does it flow? In terms of also whether you want to ask open questions or closed-ended questions, they both have benefits. The main thing is if you ask open-ended questions, the data analysis after that will be much more time-consuming. It might give you a lot of insight, but you need to think about when you design your questionnaire is how are you going to then use the data that comes out of it? Do you have the resources to look at it? So if you don't, you want to keep it simple, keep it short, and keep the questions close-ended as well. Some, in terms of like some sensitive questions that you might ask, especially around health, a way to kind of get people to answer your questions is potentially explaining why you're asking it. So explaining that you want to have the full picture and it's very important data, and you can put that either at the start of the questionnaire or within the question itself. And you had a question about how do you optimize participation, especially since the questionnaires that you're considering would be questionnaire where people self-select to participate, which kind of creates some kind of bias because people who are more engaged with the subject tend to participate more. So at the recruitment and when you send out your survey, you can think about how do you engage with your respondents. Simple things like consider the name of your survey. So there's this very huge survey called the Labour Force Survey that's run by ONS, and it's about measuring employment and unemployment. And a lot of the time when interviewers come to the house, they are sent off on their way because people don't understand, oh, I'm not part of the labor force, I'm retired. So there's something about the title of the survey as well. Like, how does it look right when you set it off that might engage people more or less. And then,
so do you think then, in the specific context of diversity, it might almost be better not to call something a diversity survey, because there are many people who feel, well, I'm not from an underrepresented group, so diversity isn't really relevant to me. Do you think a different title, a sort of whole stuff survey title, might be more effective?
Yeah, so there's a survey that is run within the civil service that is called the People Survey. And that's, I guess, gets people more engaged with it. So it doesn't really have the connotation that it might just be for people who feel they're more minority. So that could be an option, or you could just explain it a little bit more why it's important. You could also try and target some people you know are less likely to answer. So depending on how big your firm is, you might know that certain areas are less likely, so trying to target them. A good thing to do as well is also to give enough time for people to participate and to remind them. So send a reminder, that tends to boost response rates. And yeah, I think, does that answer your question? Or
it does, and I'm going to ask Jonathan now. So, you know, when you set about doing a survey at Kilburn and Strode, were these aspects of design that you considered as well? How did you design your survey?
Yeah, no, thanks, Andrea. We kept our survey really simple. So we didn't ask questions, so we didn't need to design a question. We made it a very simple tick box form. And we asked people for gender, nationality.
Those are fucking questions.
Sorry, carry on. Vanessa, you're not on mute.
I think that the point the person was saying that those are questions or are not questions, we didn't specifically have a question mark or a sentence asking for data. We had a form to say you tick a box, gender, me, male, female, other, or prefer not to say. So that was how the survey was run. Just a title, gender, and then some options, nationality. We left it blank. Marital status, options, religion, options, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity. In every one of those categories, we had a prefer not to say box as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's really important, isn't it? And where did you get those, your sort of your tick box options from? Did you go to other sources to find what would be appropriate?
Absolutely. I think, as Matthew was saying earlier, you need to allow people to identify themselves correctly. And so giving people all the options that could exist was important. And so, yes, we did lots of research, and primarily, I mean, we took our standard from some superb UK government sources in terms of surveys. I mean, each of us as citizens have to numerous occasions fill in all sorts of surveys about ethnic background, etc. And there's numerous categories. And so we did a lot of homework to make sure that we covered every possible option. And I think that that's really important.
And certainly I think organisations like Stonewall as well will also give some online advice, won't they, in terms of which, say, sexual orientations to mention and how to deal with gender questions and things. So that those can be quite useful sources of information. And in practical terms, how did you gather the data? Did you sort of email it round to all your staff and give them a certain amount of time? Or?
In practical terms, we designed a very simple form, laid out on the form why we were doing this, why we felt it was important, laid out the data protection rules around the data, told people what we were going to do with the data, told people that if they completed the form and decided that they wanted it to be deleted at any point in time, that of course they could, and sent that form to everybody in the organization, obviously with some communications around why we were doing that. We have currently a 75% response rate out of 200 people. and we didn't set a timeline on it, so people can choose to do it as and when they want to. Obviously, for new joiners coming into the organization, that's part of the onboarding process. But of course, it is a form that you can choose to complete or not to complete.
Mm-hmm. And that, presumably you make clear that that's not going to affect your employment or career development prospects at all, whether you complete that or not.
Absolutely.
Stella, can I bring you in at this point? Any tips you want to add for sort of designing the survey?
Well, thank you again. Pauline and Jonathan have said great things. I just really emphasise again, I think the communications around it is absolutely key. It's telling people, you know, why you're doing this. You know, again, that's starting to build the trust. Thinking about as well, you know, making sure line managers really understand that. And we go down to that detail when we're talking to clients about doing this. We say, make sure your line managers understand that, because often, you know, they're the people that can motivate people to complete it. So again, they need to understand why they're doing it. So those things, I think, again, some really good points about, we always make sure as well that, because things change very quickly. Again, you mentioned Stonewall there. We've just realised, you know, recently, again, making sure that we are giving more options for people around, you know, sexual orientation, gender issues and things like that. Particularly as well at the moment, talking to a client, recognising that some people are less comfortable now with the phrase BAME. So making sure that we are current with what we're doing. So we definitely do that. We make sure our network of people that, you know, can guide us about that, we're talking to them very much as well. Making sure as well that any diversity groups that are in the client as well, we're making sure that we're including them, we're making sure that they're briefed and they're understood. They're often part of what's driving it to be happening anyway, but making sure all the people that can support it really understand why we're doing it and are, you know, really part of doing that. And interesting as well, one client we worked with, I thought it was really nice, came up with the idea. The survey was called Getting to Know You.
It's a nice one. And I'll stick with you, Stella, because I'm going to move on now to, okay, so you've sort of designed your survey, you sent it out, hopefully you've got a reasonable response rate. What about the analysis? Who do you think, Stella, needs to be involved in the analysis?
Well, this is where we sometimes come in, because some of our clients, especially that's a smaller one as well, want that to be done externally. So they appreciate that, and they appreciate the part of the comms going out to do that as well. Perhaps reassures people as well. So it needs to be interpreted again in a way that, I know this is stating the obvious, but gives back helpful indicators and, you know, a clear sense of where we're at. So we have to, you know, respect the fact that, and again, I think it's a good point to make as well, when you're starting out doing this, that trust piece may not be there, despite everything that you're saying. So again, working with a couple of clients, we've suggested to them, they're not large organisations, appreciate that you may not get back as much specific data at this point, but what you're doing, you're starting to build the trust. So again, I think that's important to think about that. And also going back to this point as well, that when you are analysing it, if you've been very clear about what you're intending to do next as well, that's really going to help.
Yeah, it all helps build up the trust, doesn't it?
Yeah. So we're then, when we're doing that, we're able to then go back and discuss with the client, you know, this is where we're at. And then again, that's the starting to build up, helping them think, well, okay, bear in mind what I've got now, what could practical next steps be?
So we'll come on to that in a minute, the sort of the follow through. Matthew, any legal pitfalls that can arise during the analysis stage that we've not discussed already?
Can I just say something about the sort of building trust thing? That, you know, they're extremely good points that Stella and Jonathan have made. And I think it's important to remember that you don't have to try and do everything all at once. That, you know, this is a journey. And actually it may be better to take small steps initially. And there's been research by the Equality and Human Rights Commission that shows that people are more comfortable answering questions about some protected characteristics than others. So you might want to, you know, start by asking about age and gender and perhaps perhaps ethnic origin, but then maybe leave questions about sexuality and things like that to a later stage. Maybe do that in a couple of years' time, once you have shown people that they can have trust in the system that you've designed, that it is going to be treated anonymously and confidentially, and that it's going to be used for proper purposes.
Right. Pauline, any advice from, I mean, you've got a lot of experience of data analysis, we're most of us amateurs, any sort of tips for the non-expert professionals who find themselves analysing diversity data? So how can we avoid making sort of inappropriate assumptions?
Look at the data, don't try to make the data fit the story.
So sort of confirmation bias risk there,
yes,
I guess.
Yes. I think it helps when you present the data to also talk about the quality of it. So for example, the response rates, which Jonathan mentioned earlier, potentially comparing with other firms or comparing with other surveys that can kind of build a little bit of comparison. But I would always try and keep it visual as well. Use a lot like graph, present the information quite visually, making sure you keep it accessible. So please don't put too many colors. Remember that some people are colorblind, so some color works better than others. And also consider a little bit same as a survey design. Try and keep it simple. And consider who's reading the report. Consider your user. And I think if you keep that in mind, then you're not going to make too many mistakes.
And going back to that point you made earlier about the difference between closed and open questions, I mean, if you've got a closed question with sort of tick box options, that is much easier to analyse and get hard data from, isn't it? But the free text boxes, I guess there's more of a risk there that you read them and make assumptions about what people meant. Is that right?
Yes, and I guess it depends what you want to do with the results as well. You could just keep it to inform some internal policies or to inform a bit more, to give some background, or you could let people know that you might use it as quotes and quote the person. And another thing that I wanted to touch upon as well is, because these surveys are going to be selective surveys, self-selection surveys, so people are selecting themselves to participate rather than it being compulsory. When you talk about the results, make sure you don't talk about it as a general, like the firm is this big. Try and keep it about the respondent to the survey. So X amount of people that participate in the survey said they would be bullied or something like that.
Right. So it's not X amount of the overall population,
yes,
it's X amount of the people who filled in
have
your
answered,
survey.
yes. Because of the way that you're recruiting people, it's difficult to weight it to the general population or to weight it to the firm or the business, unless you have that information to start with. So
these external benchmarks are quite important, aren't they? You have to know what size of the overall sample did actually respond to your survey, and you have to maybe compare that against the external metrics. Certainly we found with the IP Inclusive Survey, for instance, we looked at the ratio of females and thought, oh, that's pretty good. But then we looked at the ratio of females in areas where we definitely did have data, and we realised ours were very much skewed, leading us to sort of be a bit more cautious, because clearly we've got a self-selecting sample there. So you do have to be careful of things like that. So in terms of moving on to how we use the data, Jonathan, how have you at Kilburn & Strode used the data you've gathered?
Yeah, thanks. It's really for internal policy decision points. So obviously I can see the data. It's all anonymized when we look at it. So for example, we hire a number of graduates every year, and our diversity data is really clear that at that graduate level, we need to make sure that we are
Vanessa,
hiring.
could you mute your microphone? Because we're hearing a lot of background noise.
So, for example, at graduate recruitment level, we want to make sure that we're hiring as diverse a range of people as we possibly can. So, of course, that data helps me understand where the gaps are, for example, and then leads me to make decisions around what graduate audiences that we should really be targeting. Whether that's a female audience, a male audience, an ethnic minority audience, an LGBT audience, because of course in every graduate intake we want to have as diverse a population as we can possibly hire. So the data informs actions. Some of the data we do share with on client pitches around, for example, gender mix, etc., that they ask for. But right now, it's all internal policy decisions. We haven't shared it with anyone else.
Okay. Stella, how do your clients typically make use of the data that they gather, but particularly as part of, say, an overall D&I strategy?
Absolutely. Well, we want them to be able to identify some short, medium and longer term goals for that. And again, having said that, as part of the setup with them, we are really talking to them about what their drivers are. Do they really want to get out of this? So then we'll get them thinking with that, and we do try and encourage them, as I say, to think in those three areas, and particularly try and think about some short-term goals, because this goes back to the fact if you've starting to build trust is also about doing something with the information. So we try and encourage them to look at things that they might be able to do. We then also will be very much talking to them, as Jonathan was saying as well, and it's really picking up on people, talking to them about, you know, an employee life cycle as well. So actually really stopping and getting them to think, okay, if this is an area where you are clearly, you know, underrepresented, what do you think you can start to do about that? And actually that's really helpful exercise for people, just to start to realise that they may have done something in the same way, always done, and of course, as we know, then got the same kind of results. So we're looking for them to really feel that they can identify practical things. It can also help hugely, and of course, coming from Focal Point training and consultancy, I would say this, but it really helps people then make an argument for doing some training and, you know, what they feel that they need to do, and then really getting the case to do that. And also a really important part of this as well is having got that data, also thinking, hang on a second, you sort of mentioned about, you know, sometimes it being skewed, using that to check out exactly what is happening. And again, with a number of our clients, when they've gone back and they've done that sort of bit of a deeper analysis, they maybe brought in some focus groups in a particular area, they've then found it perhaps wasn't what they thought when they initially looked at the data. So, you know, I'll give you an example. One of our clients particularly was finding that women were not making their way up into senior partner roles, and there was some speculation about why that was. And actually at that point as well, they thought quite a lot there wasn't very many opportunities to work flexibly. Anyway, when they did do that, and that's exactly what they did some focus groups and they asked people, they were surprised to find it was much more about the culture amongst the teams, and particularly about the banter and things like that. That's what they then did some training around, to work on the culture and the environment to make people feel more comfortable. It wasn't what they thought it was initially. So I think that's really important as well. And we have that conversation with people when we're looking at the data. What do we need to do to check out what we then think would be good next steps?
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned right at the start the importance of sort of gathering inclusivity data as well, not just the hard figures for diversity, but how included people feel. Do you think that that is actually better done through this sort of focus group system rather than through a survey?
Yes, I do, because you need to really tease out what that means to people. And I think really opening up and getting them to say, you know, we have some sort of very sort of practical questions then that helps people recognise. And I mean, I love, and again, we've talked about this before now, the very fact that we talk about, you know, it's the diversity, it's inclusion, but it's the true sense of belonging. And what we love when we are working with clients is when we ask them what their drivers are, and they actually express it in that kind of way, and they know they want to get there. You know, the phrase that we're enjoying hearing people talk about, bringing your whole self to work. But again, decoding that means that when I step through, and I know we're not all stepping through our office doors quite at the moment, but the equivalent of, when I step through into my workplace, I feel entirely comfortable. I belong, you know, feel that sense of belonging. So yes, and we tend to find that we can really work out whether people feel that or not. It needs the dialogue normally, and again, that's the probing, the open questions, but the probing questions as well, to really understand what it means to people. And that's the bit we particularly then enjoy working to help people to do, because we're getting closer there to, you know, what we really all do want, that sense of feeling truly comfortable in our workplaces.
Matthew, are there any particular legal pitfalls when it comes to this sort of the use stage, and particularly around reporting the data you've gathered, perhaps, or using it in your firm's internal policies?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to publishing the data, you need to be very careful that you're not publishing it in a way that could identify somebody, even if you're not sort of explicitly identifying them. So, you know, particularly if you're a small firm, that's a particular danger. So you might need to look at, you know, publishing it under broad categories rather than breaking things down to greater degree. You know, quoting statistics across the whole firm, perhaps, rather than by department, or merging certain role categories together where, you know, it might be obvious who a certain person is if you were to split it out, or, you know, even if you have given people a choice of lots of different categories for ethnicity, perhaps, you know, maybe you just publish it when it comes to publishing the data, maybe you only publish the sort of high level categories. The particular pitfall to watch out for is that if somebody's got a gender recognition certificate, if they're a transsexual person, it can be a criminal offence to disclose that without their consent. So you've got to be very careful in that regard.
Okay, that's a good one to know. Jonathan, do you mind my asking? I mean, you gathered information as sensitively and as anonymously as you can, but obviously it's a smallish firm, so you know your employees. What type of system did you use to sort of safeguard that anonymity? Did you use a sort of SurveyMonkey thing, or did you attach this to employment records?
Yes, so the data collection form was a simple Word document that people had in their email account, and if they wanted to complete it, then they were happy to send it back to us. That was part of the deal with completing it, was that you filled in the form and it would be returned to one of the HR team members who would then log that data. We've since then invested further in our HR system, so you can now do that easily, self-service onto your own HR record. So throughout the whole process, we were very explicit with exactly what we were going to do with what and when and how. So the fact that the forms would be returned to the HR team, people knew that in advance, and that was on the basis of which they would complete them. And so I think just being very, very clear with how we're gathering the information, what we're doing with it, where it's being stored, and then people say, yes, that's fine for me, I'm going to complete that form on that basis.
And then you have that explicit informed consent that Matthew was talking about.
That's right.
Getting a bit short of time now, I was going to ask the question about where can people go for further information and resources. We've made a brief mention of some of the ONS websites, for instance, and the Stonewall and other organisations where you can go for information about survey response options. What I'm going to do actually is ask the panelists if they wouldn't mind later on perhaps putting together a quick list of useful links, and I'll send that round to delegates rather than spend time on that question now. I was also going to spend some time asking about gathering sector-wide data, which is very different again to, say, Jonathan and Stella, you've talked about gathering it for specific firms, where anonymity is a slightly different issue. when we're talking about gathering it sector-wide, as IP Inclusive did, that was very much an anonymous thing, and we only reported overall figures. Rather than discuss that with the panel now, I think I'm going to move into the breakout session part, because in the breakout sessions, I'd like people to consider the questions around whether IP Inclusive should be doing some, or continuing rather to do some, we did some last year, sector-wide diversity gathering. And if so, how can we do that well, and how can people support us in that? And also the question about whether IP Inclusive's charter signatories can be expected to start gathering some data, whether that should perhaps be an expectation of a charter signatory, or whether perhaps we're not far enough on for that yet. If we are going to make it an expectation, how can we support and encourage charter signatories to gather their own data? So those are the questions that I'm going to ask people to consider in the breakout sessions. What I'm going to do now is break for just over 5 minutes. We'll break till 5:25, if that's all right. And when you come back, we will invite you to join a breakout room. We'll do that for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then hopefully have a short period to pull back the answers from all the different breakout sessions. So those will be discussing what do you think IP Inclusive should be doing sector-wide to gather D&I data, and what you think charter signatories might be expected to do going forward, bearing in mind what you've heard from the panelists about the various advantages to gathering data and the ways that we can sort of optimize the way we do that. So let's break now. I'm going to shut down my video and mute my microphone. I suggest you all go and get yourselves a drink, have a little rest, come back at 5:25, please, and hopefully the breakout rooms will be ready for then.